Hey guys, so this is my first attempt at trying to do a recorded lesson. So picture yourself here in my classroom, sitting in the front row. You get a front row seat. Everybody has a good look at the screen, I hope. I'm going to talk today about the Articles of Confederation and why they didn't work. So a short video about that, and you can take notes as I move along. So the Articles of Confederation were the first government of our nation. And actually, a lot of people don't realize this. This is the government that they wrote during the Revolutionary War. This wasn't written after the war and then they started a government. They had to have something to go by while they were fighting the war, and so they put together these Articles of Confederation. Now, what do we know about them? First of all, in the Articles of Confederation, all the states kept their sovereignty. So each state, each of the 13 states now, not colony states, because we've declared our independence, they decided that they would stay sovereign, so they kept their power. But they agreed to work together for some purposes. They mainly did that because they had this great fear of a strong central government. When they looked at England, they said, this is the problem, is that we've got this strong central government trying to tell us all what to do. We want to do things our own way. So each state wanted to keep their own rights to run their own business. They also had a fear of each other. They had a fear that some states would dominate the other states, especially a big state like Virginia and a little state, say like North Carolina, tiny population at that time. Other states were afraid that Virginia would just take over and impose their will. And the small states had their own governments, they had their own courts, they had their own systems of government, and they wanted to keep those. Now, under this government, like I said, we did some great things. We won the Revolutionary War with this system. That was a pretty big deal, especially because we didn't really have a chance. I mean, we're fighting the best military in the world. We received diplomatic recognition from other countries, which really helped us out, especially with France. So we were able to become a nation under this government. However, I would take argument with a little bit. It's our first national government, but were we really a nation yet? If all the 13 states keep their sovereignty, are we really one nation, or are we more like 13 nations agreeing to work together? All right, so what were the weaknesses of it? Why didn't the Articles of Confederation work? Whenever you look up online Articles of Confederation, you find this image a lot. I have so many troubles. I'm weak and poor. My paper money is useless. The Articles of Confederation don't support me. Yeah, one big problem was the money. And we'll talk about that later when we get into that. But Congress was lacking a lot of powers. So what did Congress not have the power to do? They did not have the power to tax. That was a big thing. That's probably what you remember from USVA history, is that Congress did not have the power to tax. That's probably the SOL point you had to remember about the Articles of Confederation. And that's a big power, because what can you do if you can't tax? How did they run the war? Well, you know what they had to do? Congress, the National Congress, had to go to the states and just ask them for money. Please, will you give us money? So that's why George Washington was always writing Congress saying, we need more money, we need more funds, we need more stuff. And Congress was saying, okay, we're trying, because how does that do when you just have to ask somebody for money? Some people will give it, some people won't. And the states had their own debts also. Congress had no power to force states to honor treaties with other countries. This was a big problem because after the war, who was going to make a treaty with the national government if they could not force Virginia or Georgia or Massachusetts to honor that treaty? So make a treaty with us, but some of us might not fulfill our side of it. That's a problem. And they could not pass laws to make laws regulating trade among the states. This is where a lot of problems came in. So if the states keep their sovereignty, when you move from one state to the other, it's like you're moving from one economy to the other, and they can have taxes and tariffs and stuff like that between the states. So regulating the trade between the states was really a problem. And this is a big one. The Articles of Confederation could not make laws directly affecting citizen behavior. So they couldn't make a law that said all citizens must do or must not do this. The only thing they were was like, under the Articles, they were like a group of people, a group of states working together, okay, and coming to some conclusions. All right, I'll give you a second so you can make sure you write those down. These are the main weaknesses of the Articles. But we're going to see as we look at the Articles together, they also had some things that we kept for our Constitution. But these are some of the things, the main things that when we write the Constitution, they made sure to put these in as a power of the federal government. All right. This is something you may not have heard of before, Shays' Rebellion. If we lived in Massachusetts, you certainly would have heard of it because it happened in Massachusetts. But down here in Virginia, we talk about Jamestown, we talk about Williamsburg. We don't talk much about Shays' Rebellion, but it actually was a really important event for our country's history. And by the way, my grammar is correct there. Shays, his name was Daniel Shays, S-H-A-Y-S, so you put the apostrophe after S for the Shays' Rebellion. This led to a lot of support for change to the Constitution. Okay, so what was Shays' Rebellion? And I'm gonna share with you guys a video that you can watch about it if you want to know some more about it, but I'll give you the basic facts here. Shays' Rebellion took place in 1786. So this is just after the end of the Revolutionary War. Things were good because we won the war, but bad because states were in a lot of debt and so was the national government. After a war, you got to pay off the debt. You got to pay off your soldiers. You got to pay off the people that made the equipment for you to use. You got to pay off the things that you went into debt for to win the war. There was a group of farmers in western Massachusetts. Now think about Massachusetts, the map. Eastern Massachusetts is where Boston is. Or as my relatives up there say, Boston. Where Boston is, in eastern Massachusetts, is where the banks were. It's where the government was, still is really. It's where in Boston, they were really oriented towards trade with England, trade with France. They were looking out to the east, trading with Europe. But in the west, you had small farmers with small plots of land trying to, make a living. And what happened was they were in debt. So Daniel Shays, who was a former soldier in the Revolution, he was actually, oh gosh, what was his rank? I think he was a colonel. Anyway, he was a former soldier in the Revolution. I should have looked that up before I made the video. He got some people together. There were a whole bunch of farmers out there, and a lot of them were former soldiers, and they were now in debt. They went off and fought for their country, and they came back, and inflation, the prices were rising, the money was not worth what it was before, but they still were paying mortgages on their farms and their homes to the banks that were over there in Boston, most of them. So they were in debt and they couldn't pay it back. It was a recession after the war. Everything was falling. The money was becoming less valuable. So they had a problem. So what happened was they got together and they talked, especially at taverns and things, and they were complaining about what was going on. I can't pay my mortgage. I can't pay for seed for my next year's crop. I don't know what I'm going to do to feed my family, all that kind of thing. And so gradually they would see that these banks would foreclose on them, and they would have to go to the, I have no idea why that bell's ringing, no one's here, but anyway, they would have to go to the court and go to this foreclosure proceeding, and a judge would decide whether they would get foreclosed on or not, and the bank would take over their farm. Well, this wasn't making them very happy, so they got together and they got their guns and they got their, whatever weapons they had maybe left over from the Revolution. Daniel Shays actually had a sword that was given to him by Lafayette. He was kind of a hero of the Revolution. And they went to the courthouse and they took their guns and they said, no, you can't have court. So they closed the courthouses down and they said, if we can't have court, then you can't foreclose on us. So we're not gonna let you have the court meeting. Well, the leaders of Massachusetts and the leaders of the owners of the banks and people who wanted their money were not gonna put up with that, right? Okay, so what happened? Eventually, they had some skirmishes and fights, and you'll see this in the video. They tried to capture the Massachusetts State Arsenal that was at Springfield, Mass. This is where Massachusetts kept their weapons, cannons and things like that. And so Daniel Shays and his group of ex-soldiers, group of revolutionaries really against the state here, they tried to capture the arsenal in Springfield, Mass. There was some, spies and things like that, and they got there, and they almost got it, but they did not get it, but they did have a battle. There was an actual battle with people shooting at each other. Massachusetts militia versus Daniel Shays and his people. And this really, the point of this is that it scared everybody, right? So the governor called out the militia, they had a battle, and this led to calls all over. This made the news all over the colonies and all over the states, excuse me. And this led to calls for a stronger national government. This led to calls from like Washington down in Virginia, who looked at what was happening up in Massachusetts and said, wait a minute, we got a lot of small farmers that are in debt too. Are they going to demand that their debts not get, that their debts get forgiven? And there was a problem with this too. If you lost your farm at this time, you lost your vote. So these farmers, if they couldn't keep their land, then they also lost the right to vote. They lost all their privileges in this country that they just risked dying for in a war. So what happened? Basically, the end of the story is the Massachusetts militia put down the Shays Rebellion. Daniel Shays fled out of the state. He ended up trying to come back, and then there was, a lot of drama there. There's a lot more story to it than I'm giving here. But the point for our purposes is under the Articles of Confederation, there was nothing the national government could do. They could not send in the National Guard because we didn't have one. They could not send in the army because Massachusetts was a sovereign state. They could not quell this problem. It was Massachusetts' problem, but if Massachusetts couldn't solve the problem, there was nothing the other states could do. And so this led people like Washington, Madison, Hamilton to start thinking about, wait a minute, the Articles of Confederation is not strong enough for us to actually stick together as a country, along with things like the money having 13 different systems of money plus the federal money, along with problems like making deals with other countries, along with the problem of not being able to have any power in the federal government. They said, we're not going to hold together. And what Washington particularly came to the conclusion was, we just won the last war. And we didn't win it very strongly. We sort of, had a lucky break at Yorktown, right? Britain's coming back is what Washington was thinking. And if we can't stick together, if we can't support each other, if we can't be one strong country, we're going to lose the next war. And so they started calling for meetings. They called for the first one in Annapolis, and then when that one only 5 states showed up, they called for one in Philadelphia. And that'll be our next part of the story, as these delegates in Philadelphia decide that they're going to scrap this old Articles of Confederation and start over with a new plan led by James Madison of Virginia.